to the project. You'll have here later today Ray Washburn from OPIC, and he'll explain to you some of the new things going on there. OPIC already has something like a $3 billion portfolio in Indo-Pacific, and that's matched by some $11 billion of private sector money. But it will be getting quite a lot of new funding, assuming that the BUILD, B-U-I-L-D program goes through the second house of Congress. It already passed very well in the first house. So that'll be another tool for development in the region, and that's potentially some $33 billion. Then you have the Asia Development Bank, which is already quite an active phenomenon, some $26 billion. You have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, that's over $3 billion. So there are lots and lots of tools starting to be brought to bear very much in the region. And they're being brought to bear in electricity, both renewables and conventional, especially transmission lines. It's also being brought to bear on water. Another very, very important issue, especially in this region.
Is the One Belt, One Road good for U.S. business? Has it been? I mean, are U.S. businesses participating? Are they
As far as we can tell, the Chinese content, both in terms of labor and materials, is virtually 100% in their One Belt, One Road program. Every country that I've been to, not just in Indo-Pacific, but in Africa and elsewhere, that's actually one of their complaints, is that there's very little local content. There also have been some complaints about the quality of workmanship. You saw this big dam in Laos, not a Chinese-built dam, it happened to be South Korean, but that just broke, collapsed. Those are the kinds of problems that countries don't need, because that leaves them with the debt from the first infrastructure project and a need to redo it all over again. So our feeling is there are more than one belt and there's more than one road. There are many belts and many roads to Indo-Pacific.
And the idea is that the Quad also be united from an infrastructure point of view.
Well, that's the hope. Now, the geography is such that there won't be too many physical linkages, but telecom, digital is certainly one big set of linkage, and we're working quite actively to try to facilitate that, particularly as 5G comes into telecom.
Right. So all of us know, you know better than all of us, you've been in business. Part of the idea is you start with a strategy, and that's a very complicated thing to do, but then there's the execution. Can you take us inside the administration? How does something like this get executed? Is it an interagency process? Is the cabinet, do they get together and discuss, are the ambassadors in here? You know, how do you execute a strategy with so many components and variables?
Well, first of all, the development of the strategy came about through the NSC convening the interagency groups, and we started at a relatively low level, then it gets to the kind of deputy level, then it gets to cabinet level, then it gets to the president for approval. So it's a very thorough, very meticulous, very detailed process by which the strategy is developed. That's important because along the way, you get the buy-in of all the different departments. It literally comes from the bottom up. Therefore, everybody is intellectually and hopefully emotionally committed to the end result.
Local ambassadors, everybody else is...
Everybody. In fact, in terms of the ambassadors, we're doing a number of things. Commerce is now putting a digital attaché into the Indo-Pacific region, because there's so many problems with digital, with the e-commerce constraints of many countries, with the localization of data, with the issue of privacy, immense kinds of issues. So we're going to have some specialized talent in the region. Second thing we're doing, we already have foreign commercial service people in more than 30 countries in this cities in this region. We will be adding some to them, and we're entering into a pilot program with the State Department to try to figure out how to get better leverage at the ambassadorial level, better introductions to the business community, rather than just totally focusing on strategic defense and geopolitical concerns. So there's very good cooperation, particularly between the State Department and ourselves. In addition, we've taken a very specific move, which I'm announcing now, that we have granted to India strategic trade authorization status, STA1. And that's a very important change in their status under our export control regime. It acknowledges the U.S.-India security and economic relationship. And what it does is it comes under the Export Administration rules, and it authorizes the export, re-export, and in-country transfer of specific items to destinations that the U.S. regards as low risk. Currently, 36 countries, mostly all the NATO countries, have this status. So it's a very elevated status from an export control point of view. And it's because India has partnered with us to improve its own export control regimes and has met most of the multilateral export rules that we think are useful. It finally reflects India's status as a major defense partner of the U.S. STA1 provides India greater supply chain efficiency, both for defense and for other high-tech products. It will increase the activity with the U.S. systems, the interoperability of the systems, and it will reduce the time and resources needed to get licensing approved. We calculate that it will be a competitive advantage for the U.S. in terms of supplying those kinds of products to India. It looks as though that over the last 7 years, some 9.7 billion of products would have been affected. So it's a meaningful sized number, and probably it'll be much more than that, because a lot of things that they knew wouldn't be exportable, they didn't order from us.
And we are exporting LNG to India.
We're exporting it to just about every place in the region. So far, relatively limited quantities. And part of that is a strange problem in the U.S. side. There's been so much activity in the Permian Basin that the surface transportation for getting it from the Permian over to the export ports is lagging behind. So there's a tremendous amount of road construction, tremendous amount pipeline construction, tremendous amount of even more detailed infrastructure like schools, housing, to deal with this incredible boom in the Permian.
Secretary, I've got two more questions. One related to China. Secretary Pompeo mentioned partnership, not domination. And I thought interesting concept. We've sort of set up China as our rival, as our competitor. Is the idea to achieve this partnership, not domination, within our two systems, or does China first have to make adjustments to be more like a Western type economy? Can you just talk about the partnership, not domination, as it relates to China?
Well, but what we mean by it is something that also has quite relevance to the rest of the Indo-Pacific region, in that we're looking for commercial relationships that are commercially based, that are not driven by other kinds of impulses. For example, protection of intellectual property rights. To us, that's a very fundamental activity and a very important one. Recently, the U.S. Patent Office, which, as you know, Secretary, is part of Department of Commerce, we recently issued our 10 millionth patent. No country in the history of the world has ever approached anything like 10 million patents. And most interestingly, more than half of them were issued in the last 30 years. So the entire history of the U.S. prior to 30 years ago produced fewer patents than we have in the last 30. And if we calculated the last 5, that would be even a huge percentage. So IPR is really important because it's the future. So we have a great deal of difficulty with forced technology transfers. We have a great deal of difficulty with cyber attacks. We have a great deal of difficulty with outright theft of IPR. So our strategy has 2 components to it. One is to deal with today's world, and that's things like steel, aluminum, possibly automobiles. The other part is to deal with the future, and that's largely the high-tech areas. So we feel there's a need to normalize dealings and level the playing fields, both in terms of the traditional industries and in terms of the future industries.
Thank you. So I thought that the audience would like to hear, and maybe give you a chance, to tell them why they're not going to look back 5 years from now or 10 years from now and say, boy, I wish we wouldn't have gotten out of TPP.
Well, unfortunately, in big geopolitical things like TPP, there is no way to do a controlled experiment. So no one will ever know what would have been the outcome from TPP. I think what people in some cases have already forgotten, TPP was dead regardless of who won the election. Both Hillary Clinton and President Trump campaigned actively against TPP. And my perception of the Congress is the votes weren't there in any event. So it's a little bit of reformist thinking to say, well, Trump killed the TPP. He did, but TPP was going nowhere. The real question isn't looking backward. I think the real question is looking forward. How do we develop better relations with the individual countries? How do we maximize total trade while at the same time dealing with the imperfections in their systems, the government procurement problems, the corruption problems, the standards that are not science-based problem. There are myriad problems that contribute to the trade deficits and that are not inherently part of free trade. And that's the last point that I'd like very much to make. The President has made extremely clear, both at the G7, more recently when we were talking with the EU, his objective at the end of the line is 3 zeros: 0 tariffs, 0 non-tariff trade barriers, and 0 subsidizing of businesses. If we can get to those 3, we believe that American business can be very, very competitive anywhere. But we do need a levelized playing field. And many of these countries, including in the Indo-Pacific region, are far better at the rhetoric of free trade than they are at its practice. They are, in fact, far more protectionist than the U.S. And so when I was at the OECD and again when I was in Davos, they had a panel. And my first question to the panel was, if the U.S. is not in fact the least protectionist big nation, please tell me who is. And you know what? They had no answer, because we are the least protectionist nation.
I think everybody would agree with the 3-0 strategy. That sounds great. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Wilbur Ross, thank you for your service.